Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. And it is absolutely wonderful to see such a full room here and to know we've got the same number again online. So thank you so much for being here. I'm Caroline Lucas, and I was recently appointed alongside Dominic Grieve as one of the co-presidents of the European movement, and I'm absolutely delighted to be that and to be with you this morning. And what we're going to do now, and I am very aware that we stand between you and your lunch, so we're going to be very provocative and inspiring, I'm sure. But what I want us to do now is to turn our minds to environment and climate, that other massive security threat, frankly, that we face, and to have this panel to look at the environmental impacts of having left the EU, but also about how some of those steps towards rejoining the EU and building trust could absolutely be done by strengthening our links on environmental issues. So I'm delighted to have a panel with me. First of all, let me introduce you to Michael Nicholson, Head of the UK Environment Policy at the Institute for European Environmental Policy, IEEP. It's a sustainability think tank, for those of you who don't know, with over 40 years of experience of research and analysis in the UK and on the interaction between UK and EU policy. Michael has also worked for the Environment Agency and for the EU Network for the Implementation and Enforcement of Environmental Law. So he is hugely well experienced in this area, and we are massively grateful to him for giving up part of his weekend to be with us this morning. And then we have, of course, Emma Knaggs, very well known to you as Deputy CEO of the EM, but also crucially Head of Grassroots Engagement. And if I can just explain the rationale for this panel. Essentially, one of the reasons I was so excited to be appointed as a co-president of the European movement is because I see so much potential for the European movement to be working much more closely with green groups, both nationally and locally as well. I think that would be a massively important thing to do in its own right, but I also think that it would increase the European movement's profile and relevance with a natural constituency of potential supporters who I think would see that common ground between our agenda and their agenda. So the purpose of this session is twofold. First of all, to share some up-to-date information that we can use in our campaigning for closer relations with the EU and ultimately to rejoin. And then with Emma to explore the opportunities for the European movement, both locally and nationally, to work more closely with those environmental groups who I believe should be our natural allies and hopefully our members as well. So Michael will give the policy update, and then Emma will outline some of the ways that EM can work with the local groups to make those connections, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions as well. I wanted to just say a few words by way of setting the scene. I was an MP, and as you can imagine, when I have a microphone, I can't possibly stop now, so I'm going to say a little bit more, but not too much. I simply want to say, I guess, that it's been said that the scale of the law changes post-Brexit mean that environmental legislation in Britain is facing deaths by 1,000 cuts. And in practice, that includes changes to the laws being made by the EU, but that the UK isn't following, as well as planned divergences, deliberate divergences from existing EU law. And it means, for example, practically speaking, that things like toxic chemicals that are banned in the EU are continuing to be used in the UK. When it comes to pesticides, for example, the amount of residue allowed on scores of food types in the UK has soared since Brexit, with some now 1,000 times higher than the limits allowed within the EU. So there are some 100 items now allowed to carry far more pesticides when sold to the public in the UK, ranging from potatoes to onions, from grapes to avocados. It also means that our waters will be dirtier and the consumer products that we use are more likely to contribute to things like global deforestation. And Michael will no doubt have a lot more data on all of that. But suffice to say that from an environmental point of view, with a very few exceptions, Brexit has been the disaster that many of us predicted that it would be. So there are big environmental concerns around the impacts of Brexit, but there are also some real opportunities that I hope we can explore too, in terms of elements that we can rejoin as part of this trust building, confidence building strategy that we've heard more about. And so, for example, Mark mentioned briefly rejoining the European Environment Agency, and I hope that's going to be a real area of campaigning priority for the European movement, because the EEA is that Copenhagen-based body that coordinates pan-European data sharing and reporting on green issues. And we abruptly departed from it as a consequence, of course, of Boris Johnson's pledge to get Brexit done. It had a vital role in developing the scientific basis for key Europe-wide policies on climate change, nature protection, pollution control, and the circular economy. And we can be very clear that membership does not infringe our national sovereignty, if that's our obsession, as it is with, sadly, many, because there are 5 non-EU member states among its members already: Ireland, Liechtenstein, Norway, Switzerland, and Turkey. It goes without saying that environmental pollution knows no borders. So to rejoin the EEA would be both a practical way of working more closely together on shared common problems over things like shared species and habitats, but also another way of building that trust and confidence. Frankly, the same arguments apply to the LIFE programme. You might remember the LIFE programme was essentially the only EU funding programme entirely dedicated to environment, climate and energy objectives. It funded a huge number of projects in the UK. We did incredibly well out of it. It's a sister programme to Horizon. Of course, we've rejoined Horizon. We have not rejoined LIFE. And again, there are third-party members who are, or third parties who are members, who are not members of the EU. So again, this is something that can be pursued without crossing any of the government's famous red lines. 2 other very quick things: chemicals alignment. Brexit meant that we left the so-called REACH agreement on regulating chemicals, and we set up our own institute to do that, but we are now massively out of step with the EU. What does that mean? It means that, for example, on substances of very high concern, since we left the EU has added 38 chemicals to that list of very high concern, and the UK has added 1 big fat 0. And that's going to have serious effects on things like quality of our drinking water and so forth. So these things really matter. So that's another area we could pursue. And finally, just a few words on aligning our emissions trading system with the European emissions trading system. Again, both sides would benefit from that, both from the point of view of electricity trading, but also crucially from our shared decarbonisation goals. So there are some real benefits of that closer alignment that I think we can demonstrate in very practical terms, as well as it being a way, as I say, of building those links with greener groups and also demonstrating the trust and confidence that I think we have to do when we are talking about those closer links with the EU. So without further ado, let me hand the floor now to Michael, and thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody, and good morning to everybody online. I'm a bit nervous following Caroline. Caroline is a political hero of mine. I've been in the environment field for over 20 years now, and people like Caroline deserve a lot of praise for really pushing the environmental agenda, not just here in Britain, but across Europe and the world generally. And I'm absolutely delighted that she, along with Dominic, have taken over the chair roles here at the European Movement. Now, I was given the brief of talking about the environmental impacts of leaving the European Union. And I think it's fair to say it's still relatively early days in the broad sweep of history, but there are already concerning developments. Some that have emerged already, some that are emerging. But before I go on to that, I'd just like to talk a little bit, maybe go backwards in time and just talk about, first of all, how the membership of the European Union for Britain really benefited us on the environment and how it helped to push forward environmental policy. So I'm going to first of all quote who I think is one of the godfathers of British environmental policy. He's a mentor of mine. He's a former director and founder of the London office of my institute, the Institute for European Environmental Policy, Nigel Haig, OBE. He wrote a book back in 1984 where he quotes, "British environmental policy is a deeply rooted plant which over the last 10 years has shown fresh growth under a new stimulus." Now, he was talking at a time when the UK, having joined what was then the EEC in 1972, or rather the 1st of January 1973, he was talking about our membership of the European community. And Nigel was also talking about the Industrial Revolution. He was talking about the fact that the Industrial Revolution started here in Britain, but that also meant severe environmental damage and degradation started here too. But on the flip side, policies to try and manage and limit that degradation also started here too. So we have, of course, had made some improvements before we joined the EEC and the EU, but of course, that was we had made some progress towards that, but change really only began to start happening after we joined. Now, some may, of course, argue that things may have changed anyway, even if we hadn't been a member of the EEC or the EU, but some people might argue that perhaps our membership of international agreements that was beginning to proliferate in the latter half of the 20th century might have helped us to develop our environmental policy. But these are not quite the same as or as influential as the membership of the European Union with its huge political and policy-making machinery. Of course, the European Union is a very big player economically and a very big player diplomatically. And it's, of course, a truism, as Caroline said, that environment knows no bounds. It doesn't respect national boundaries. And also, the EU and its precursors are able to achieve results on environment and environmental policy in a way that no one member country can achieve on its own. Environmental protection is set down in its treaties, in its core primary legislation, which is, of course, very, very hard to change. And this is a real big benefit because it meant that standards set by secondary laws that the EU member states, the 27 member states now, are far less likely to pull these things apart by perhaps short-term interests of individual groups of politicians or in the short-term interests of individual parliaments. The EU is also very good at setting numerical targets and processes down in its legislation. It's very good at setting time-bound, measurable things within its legislation. And this is something that Britain, before we joined the EEC, was not very good at doing. We were very vague and very woolly in our language. We were very woolly in our language, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. This was partly because the European Commission is wanting to be a check on member states, to be able to ensure that member states are doing the right thing. But it's very good for accountability because NGOs and civil society too can hold our governments and our leaders to account through very open and transparent information. Now, talking about accountability, the European Union also obviously has very strong institutions. The European Commission, backed up by the Court of Justice, with its very, very big sticks, its ability to fine member states is, of course, a very good way of pushing member states to do things and to make sure that countries like Britain was holding its end of the bargain. But of course, also the EU is very good at pooling resources, pooling sovereignty, not detracting away from it, but pooling it all together. And it's also very good at pulling together experts across a whole range of different fields and expertise in a way that no single country can hope to achieve. Now, I'm not somebody who is wholly without any criticism whatsoever of the European Union. There are things that it does that are not good. And it can, of course, be a lot better on the environment. I do not pretend otherwise. But on the whole, Britain has been far better off being a member of the European Union and having had this experience than if we weren't a part of it at all. And the EU have also learned from Britain during this time. So, and we mustn't forget that things, really core bits of legislation around the Water Framework Directive and the Waste Framework Directive, really key bits of river basin management plans and waste plans. These are things that originated here in Britain and which influenced the direction of environmental policy around Europe. So bringing us back to the present, now that we're outside of the EU, I think some people are beginning to ask, will we become the dirty man of Europe again? Now, this was a term that was thrown around in the early 1970s. A lot of countries were worried about Britain and the things that we did and the attitude that we had to environmental policy. It's, of course, perhaps very understandable that we are worried about becoming the dirty man of Europe again, because as we see sewage rife in our freshwaters, in our lakes and in our rivers, it's on our beaches, horrible, disgusting scenes, and people are obviously getting sick. And of course, we're a very nature depleted country, and something that we really need to do something about, of course. At IEEP, the Institute for European Environmental Policy, we have been studying this divergence, this change in legislation since Brexit. When we left the European Union, we had essentially the same rule book. And over time, we are starting to diverge from one another. And we're looking at this in different ways, through different lenses. So we're looking at UK law changing and leading to differences with the European Union. We're looking at EU law changing and leading to differences with the UK. But we're also looking at it in terms of changes in the way in which the UK implements and enforces law here in the UK too. And this is broadly what we've found so far. And of course, the story's not over and it's ever changing. It's a very dynamic situation. Generally speaking, and of course, there's lots of caveats in this, what we found is that the EU is moving ahead. It's become a much more progressive policymaker on environment. And on the other hand, the UK has tended towards moving much more slowly. It's tended to have a much lower level of ambition, and it's tended to have a much less stringent approach to regulation. Now, of course, depending on which particular areas of policy these things are changing, and also depending on which part of the UK, which nation of the United Kingdom you're looking at, these things are slightly different. But what we're seeing is generally that. Now, just a word about the European Union, and I know that Mark very eloquently talked about this in his speech before. The Green Deal, maybe many of you have heard about this, the European Green Deal was implemented by the last Commission of Ursula von der Leyen, and Notionally, it's still underway, it's still being implemented, but what we're starting to see is a green lash, a sort of backlash against some of these policies. And Mark was referring to this. We've seen a watering down of a lot of policies, a wafer-thin margins of certain EU policies in the European Parliament were observed. So some environmental laws only just squeaked through when in previous years we would have seen quite large majorities. The rise of net zero skeptics, as Mark talked about, across the European Union, within member states, but also at the European level, is very concerning. And a lot of people in these countries are openly anti-net zero and anti-environmental policy, and that's very concerning. And they are also being cheered on, perhaps, by the new United States president, who, again, is very clearly anti-environment and anti-climate. I was reading just earlier this week the fact that he signed into law an executive order about plastic straws. He wanted to bring back plastic straws. Fantastic, isn't that great? Yes, very, very, very good. So, sorry, there's no sarcasm there at all. Let me talk about some specifics on environmental policy, areas in which the European Union has actually taken forward progressive environmental policy. Caroline talked about chemicals, and that's really probably the most clear example. It's a very good case because Michael Gove, he was the Environment Secretary at the time, he said that we would have the best chemical system once we left the European Union. Now, of course, it was all rhetoric, you know, and I'm not going to spoil the story by saying, no, we've not ended up having the best system. We have ended up having a much worse system. What we've found with REACH, which is this regulatory framework that has been established, in some part to try and mirror what the European Union has, and which the UK was a part of when we were part of the European Union, we found that there has been a lack of capacity at regulatory bodies like the Health and Safety Executive. There is a lack of data and transparency over chemical safety information. And don't take my word for this. This is the National Audit Office saying these things. There's fewer and weaker protections. Now, Caroline mentioned some of the statistics, and just to add to that, a further 24 files for restricting chemicals have been started by the EU. Only 3 have been started by the UK, one on lead ammunition, one on harmful substances in tattoo ink, and also in PFAS in firefighting foams. But the big headline is that a large number of restrictions of very dangerous chemicals, harmful chemicals, have been restricted by the European Union. Here in the UK, it's 0. And this is because of that lack of capacity. It's really a very concerning situation. And we're still waiting for a chemical strategy 5 years or more after we were promised one. Air quality standards have been tightened by the European Union. They've brought in a new directive to bring the European Union air quality standards much closer to where the World Health Organization suggests we ought to be. Air quality is one of those big silent killers that we really ought to be trying to solve here. And there was a study just last year by the UCL, which said that over 40,000 premature deaths in the UK are linked to air quality. I mean, this is a shocking state of affairs that we really ought to be trying to sort out. On waste and circular economy, the EU is tackling textile and food waste, particularly fast fashion, which you probably know about. Batteries regulation, they're putting in place new rules to set targets for resource and recycling efficiency. On nature, there's been a very big nature restoration law that was passed in the European Union just last year. This was one of those laws that only just squeaked through, but it's a massive bit of legislation. On commodity-driven deforestation, this is a really big piece of legislation the European Union have passed to ban imports of products associated with both legal and illegal deforestation. The UK, or rather England specifically in this case, in its Environment Act of 2021, had a section on it where it would also tackle this issue of commodity-driven deforestation. However, 4 or 5 years later, we're still waiting for secondary legislation to actually put it into effect. So the Shell Act, primary act is there, but we still haven't actually had the actual implementing legislation. And even when it does come in, the plan by the government is only to tackle illegal forest degradation. And that approach relies on good governance, enforcement capabilities, and the legality of deforestation in different countries around the world, like Brazil and Indonesia. So even when it does come in, it won't be as effective as the approach taken by the EU. On climate, the emissions trading scheme has been extended to aviation and shipping, buildings, roads, road transport. The UK has only done a little bit of this. One particular bit of policy that I'm particularly like is around something called the Social Climate Fund. The European Union have put in place basically a pot of money generated by the revenues from the emissions trading scheme to help fund energy efficiency improvements in people's homes, particularly low-income families. On energy efficiency, the EU has passed a law requiring a reduction in the consumption of energy. The UK, check this, this is ridiculous. So we had here in the United Kingdom something called an energy efficiency task force, which was set up to try and tackle this issue of energy efficiency. It was a collection of experts from across industry and academia. Rishi Sunak, as soon as he came into government, scrapped the whole thing. We still don't really know what the government, even the current government's policy on energy efficiency is. Urban wastewater treatment, so sewage. The European Union have also put in place a new law to tighten up standards on sewage. Critical raw materials, I think Mark mentioned something around this. Industrial emissions, the list goes on. These are all things that the EU have done that we haven't always followed suit, or even where we have, we've gone slower and with less ambition. But I don't want you to go away thinking that the EU equals good and the UK equals bad, because there are actually some examples of where the UK has used its new situation to the benefit of the environment. There's not many, but there are some good examples. So you may have seen in the newspapers a few weeks ago a situation around sand eels. Now these are little groups of fish that are relied upon by marine species and by seabirds. And as part of our post-Brexit environmental policy, the UK government banned the fishing of sand eels. An absolutely brilliant decision for the environment, brilliant decision. Now, the European Union, as part of its agreement with the UK, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, has invoked what's called an arbitration panel. Basically, it's taking the UK to court effectively over this, saying that it's unfair and it's driven mostly by the French and Danish governments because they want to keep on fishing these sand eels. And this case is ongoing, and we've really got to hope that the British win on this particular occasion, because this is very important. On agriculture policy, at least in England, we're starting to move more fully away from an area-based payment system and towards one which is public money for public goods. And this is a very good thing. So we're effectively paying farmers and land managers to look after their environment, look after their land in a much more environmentally friendly way. This is something that we have been doing across England more and more over the last few years, even though that there are some issues around the funding linked to that. We've also banned the trade in shark fins, the import and export of shark fins. And there's also something called biodiversity net gain. Some of you may have heard of that already. There is some flaws in this particular policy and some funding concerns, but there are some positive aspects of that. So there are some good examples out there that we have started to put in place, irrespective of our involvement with the European Union. But overall, what we have seen is that the UK has fallen behind on environmental policy. 2 minutes, I'm wrapping up. So there are a few worrying signs. Environmental impact assessment and planning. The government's going for growth at all costs agenda is particularly worrying for nature and for the environment, and also for nutrient neutrality rules. These rules have been put in place for a very good reason, to protect the environment, and we must try and avoid the government riding roughshod over these things. Going forward, environmental principles such as the precautionary principle and the polluter pays principle, in the EU, these were set down in treaties, and here in the UK, we need to make sure that we protect those and make sure that they don't fall foul of the government's going for growth agenda. Scrutiny bodies like the Office for Environmental Protection and Environmental Standards Scotland, these are bodies set up to ensure that the government and its agencies are implementing the law properly, need to be well funded, have the teeth and independence to act. And we need to make sure that they're not at the whim of any one government and any one parliament. Accountability, we need to resist the urge to go back to woolly, vague, discretionary terms in legislation. In the Environment Act, for example, there's a reference to due regard that ministers can exercise their due regard to something, whatever that means. I don't know what that means. And finally, we need to make sure our regulatory agencies have the resources and capacity to do their job and do their job properly. So there are some good things, but there are also some very worrying things, and we need to make sure that we are very mindful of that going forward. Thank you.
Well, a huge thank you to Michael. It was a massive job that you were given, and to do that in 20 minutes was a tour de force. So thank you so much. And I guess just sort of, I'm not going to try and sum up what you said, but I think that sense that we also got from Mark about how we actually are better when we work together. That's not to say, as you were saying, and as Mark has said, it's not the case that the EU all good, UK all bad, but it is the case that working together, we're better than working apart. And I think that is a real theme that's coming through this morning. Delighted to hand over to Emma now, who I think will speak a little bit more about opportunities for working together with other groups at a local level to build our capacity, and both in terms of building our capacity to focus on some of these issues, but also in terms of attracting more people to join us when they recognise that their agenda is our agenda to a great extent as well.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Caroline. Of course, we're very privileged to have someone of Caroline's caliber and experience now as part of the European movement, that we can really build on that and make sure that the environmental messaging and campaigning is something. It's a bit quiet. I can hear myself very well. Is that better? Okay, good. And also really excellent for us to build relationships with the IEEP. Is obviously an organisation that does incredibly important work. So I really hope this is the beginning of a long relationship. Now, grassroots campaigning is really one of the USPs of European movements. There aren't really many other pro-European campaigns that have the network of people like you around the country that are really there in your local areas, in communities all across the UK. Obviously, you know your area best, and people listen to people that they trust. and people that they know are from that area and have similar sort of life experiences and things like that. So long term, if our ultimate aim really is to be back in the EU, we need to work on this community building, and our grassroots campaigners and all of our members are absolutely central and core to all of that. We are going to need those relationships, especially when it comes to an ultimate rejoin campaign. In the same way that we as the European movement are building up our credibility at a national level, both on media, on campaigning, on working with all sorts of partners, in local groups, you can also do the amazing work as well. There are lots and lots of organizations that will exist in your area, either sort of sub groups of national campaigns or other grassroots campaigns that have come up on one or two particular issues. I know, for example, Herefordshire for Europe have been hoping to work with Friends of the River Wye campaign. So if you know anything about the River Wye, they are having awful issues at the moment with pollution and largely runoff from agricultural lands. So they're hoping to build a campaign in collaboration with them about those issues and sort of work together to really increase the visibility of that campaign. Different issues will resonate in different areas. Obviously, anyone bordering the River Wye will be very concerned about river pollution. In your area, it may be something else. It could be beaches, it could be chemicals, it could be all sorts of things. So really, this is a plea for you to maybe go back and think about what are the core environmental issues that affect your particular area of the country. Environment is the #1 concern of younger people as well. We see this a lot in a number of surveys that come up. It really is an issue that connects with young people in particular. So what is the hot environmental topic in your area? And is there a way for you to connect with it and maybe amplify their message, but also access the sort of people that are attracted by those campaigns? Now, I know I've heard particularly local groups recently that obviously many of us have been doing this for close to 10 years now, and there are some committees that are starting to sort of tire a little bit. It is still going to continue to be a long road. Bringing young people in may be a way of refreshing some of your teams, some of your committees, bringing some new energy, bringing a new perspective. It really is an opportunity if you can go and find them with a campaign that actually resonates with them and something they're interested in. This really could be an opportunity to sort of grow your teams as well in your local area. This might mean a different campaigning style. This might mean a way of talking to people in a different way. It might mean that if you're heavily Remain branded, that might not be the best way to connect, but really think about your audience, think about who you're trying to talk to, think about who you're trying to persuade in those areas as well. We've done that. So we will be putting together a campaign on the environment in collaboration with Caroline and other people in the campaign. So we're looking to have that ready for you later this year. But in the meantime, really start thinking about making those relationships, building that community, getting in touch with campaigns and thinking about the issues that are real and pertinent to your area and how we can tie those in. I'm going to keep that very short so that we've got a bit of time for discussion, but hopefully that's given you some food for thought. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Emma, for bringing that really down to the grassroots and reminding us that there's plenty we can be doing locally. You said food for thought. I'm worried people are more concerned about food for their stomachs, but if people have 5 minutes for any questions, or if you have actually practical examples of what's worked in your area that you could share that then others could learn from, that would also be a very wonderful thing. And the first hand I saw was the gentleman over there.
We do also have a couple of questions online, Caroline. Just
Okay.
Caroline, thank you. Mark Johnston. Michael and Emma, both thank you very much. Michael, has IEEP done any work on CBAM, on carbon border adjustments? And as I understand it, I think the UK is trying to catch up with an equivalent measure, but insofar as it hasn't yet, are we exposed to trade risk with Europe as they continue to implement and we struggle to catch up? And if so, how might those trade risks play out sector by sector? Thank you very much.
Hold that just a second. We'll take a few and then we'll come back. So yeah, straight ahead of me. Yeah. Actually, I think you need the microphone because otherwise they won't hear you online.
It's a very quick question. Might EM UK put together for us, rather than each of us doing some work on it, put together a list of the national organisations that would help, so that we could then perhaps go to them and then find out the local regional branches? That's my question.
Good. Yes, the person behind. And if there are any women, oh, there is. There are. Your hand attached. You go first, and then we'll come. Yeah.
Thank you. A question for Caroline. I was really shocked. You said the UK pollution, whatever you call it, in the food chain is 1,000 times worse than in you, something like that.
I'll come back to that. Yeah. All right.
I'd like to come back to that point and
Sure.
ask about it. Does that get into the food chain, and does it mean that we can vote with our wallets by buying European food rather than UK food? I mean, you know what I'm getting at. If their food is cleaner than our food, the food that they export to us, will that still be cleaner? That's the question. Thank you very much, Caroline.
Thank you. Yeah. And then there's
Hi, Jackie from Leeds for Europe. I was just a bit concerned about your last comment there about, so perhaps dial down the Remain message and speak to environmental groups. If I want to join an environmental group, I'll do that. And in fact, do belong tangentially to few. And in Leeds for Europe, we've always engaged with other groups, like Pride in August and the Irish community for the St. Patrick's March, for example. I'm not dialing down this Remain. I'm sorry, I know that's the zeitgeist of this meeting. I joined European Movement to rejoin the EU. And maybe, we do single market, customs union, blah, blah. But, the people we meet on the street stalls are saying, well, what are you doing? And I'm not going to say, oh, well, I'm going to, talk to the, the Green Group about environmental issues. They are there. We are there on the streets talking about rejoining the EU. End of. You might have a different view on that. You might have a different view on that,
okay.
But I did not join European Movement to become a, to find different things to talk
I'm going to stop you there because we need to get some answers, and then I need to come to a couple of people online. Emma will be able to speak for the EM generally, but in my view, that isn't actually what anyone is saying. We're recognizing that in order to achieve our objectives, we need to be able to have conversations with people who aren't necessarily in the same space as we are right now. And that might just mean that we have to think about how we bring them with us. It's not about dialing things down. It's just about an extra element of sensitivity, I think. CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism. I love the way we're going to go from the very complex to the less so. But.
Yeah, good question, and it's perhaps one that's far too complex to deal with here, and maybe we can have a conversation afterwards. But carbon border adjustment mechanism. This is effectively the European Union wanting to avoid the outsourcing, or rather the leakage of heavy industries to places where environmental rules in other parts of the world are not as strong as in Europe. And they want to put a tax, effectively, an import tax on products coming from outside. It's trying to encourage other places in the world to put in place other similar carbon prices on their products. It's usually the heavy industries that it's targeting most, so steel and things like that. But as I understand it, I'm far from an expert on this, so you got me worried asking about this. As I understand it, this is potentially one of the areas in which the UK and EU will be able to collaborate on. And the mood music, not only of the current government, but even of the previous governments, were of collaboration and cooperation and coordination on this topic of carbon border adjustment mechanisms. And I suspect that this might be a point of serious discussion in the upcoming EU-UK reset talks that are due for May 19th, I believe. So, yeah.
Do you want to say something about national organisations and
Yes,
producing yeah.
Chris, that's a really good idea about the list of national organisations. So I'm sure that's something that we could pull together. Absolutely, definitely a really good idea. Thank you. Yeah.
And in terms of the question about pesticides, I was just Googling, just suddenly nervous about where I got that, that piece of evidence from. I don't know if it's something that you recognise. I have to confess that my my source was the Guardian newspaper, which but it was based on a scientific report. And it said that, for example, when it comes to the maximum residue level in tea, so tea bags and tea, so for example, it was increased by 4,000 times the amount that it was in the EU. But
just to add that the Pesticide Action Network, which is an NGO, has a really good study on this just recently, looking at imports from other parts of the world into Europe and the UK in particular. Go and check it out.
The Guardian, the September 2024, were you to wish to find it from there. We've kind of got time probably for 2 questions online, if you can find them.
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions online. Well, there were quite a few, but some of them have been answered by the other questions already. Jenny is asking that the UK is still part of the Council of Europe, and can this be an enabling link for the links that we've lost as part of leaving the EU? And James is asking, should people who are interested in campaigning on environmental issues as part of the wider campaigns they're doing with their local group join individually for the local groups, or is it better from your point of view if the groups work together as opposed to like individual members joining?
You want to take the first one at all, the Council of Europe, or otherwise I can ask Emma,
I'm
who
not
might.
so familiar with the work of the Council of Europe.
Neither am I have to say. So,
Dominic,
yeah.
Council of Europe, can you help us?
Yes, the Council of Europe.
Thank you.
Although the Council of Europe deals principally with issues around human rights and security, yes, it is possible at the Council of Europe level to discuss issues around pollution, and I've seen them do it. So I don't know what they're doing at the present time, but yes, it brings together a wide range of states who are not members of the EU, and they can certainly pass resolutions and encourage their governments to do something about it.
Brilliant, thank you. And on the second question, I think, do you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. I think both are good options, either joining as individually or working together as groups. I think it's a case of being flexible, really, and seeing what works best in your local area. Obviously, say your local group working with another group together and sort of amplifying each other's activities or doing joint events and things like that would probably be a really good way of highlighting it in the local community. But if it is just sort of individuals being part of other campaigns as well, then absolutely that's an option. But like I say, different areas will work in different ways. You'll have different campaigns and different topics that will be more pertinent in your area. So I think both would be excellent options.
I was going to say as well that I think a lot of it can be around sort of the media coverage that hopefully would be got if you're coming together, in which case, you know, I don't think people should have to feel that they need to join an environmental group before they can do that. I would see it much more as being a collaboration between groups on the ground. And if you're minded to join that group, great. But actually, I think it's more about the cooperation on the ground, really. Michael was just saying that he had a couple of thoughts on this too.
Yeah, just on local environmental groups. I anticipated this question coming up, and I did a bit of Googling. So wetland trusts, wildlife trusts, RSPB, nature reserve, volunteering. There's a food and farming. Check out your local sustainable food places network, which helps with community garden projects and where to shop and eat ethically locally. The Orchard Project Network, Pesticide Free Town network run by Pesticide Action Network UK, and the Transition Towns Network. There's several local initiatives that people can get involved with to support actions locally.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And there are 2 very vigorous hands that still remain. So I'm going to take the man in the maroon top and then person at the very back. If there were a woman, I'd be delighted.
Thank you. It's actually a very practical question. We in Cambridge for Europe, Virgil Sharkies in our area, and there's a lot of concern over water in particular and rivers, etc. It's an area we're looking to get involved in. One of the things we kind of asked ourselves, we're nervous about, is seeming to kind of be hijacking another campaign or trying to, join a bandwagon. We haven't been involved in it before. Why are we suddenly interested? I think these things issues. So I think what we would like and where EM centrally can possibly help is have some steer on what our offer can be. What are the issues that we should raise when we're communicating with them, where the being closer with the EU can help our involvement, and also what we can ask. What are we looking for? What or we could do? I mean, it would probably vary specifically from place to place, but I think some guidance on that, as well as who we can contact, is what should our pitch be, in a way.
It's a very, very good question. Thank you for asking that. And I think it'll become clearer when there's more of a kind of a national campaign behind it as well. But I would see it even something as simple as suggesting that when, for example, the local group is thinking about going to talk to their MP about action on river pollution, then to have a strand in their lobbying work to also be thinking about, well, would closer relations with the EU also help us in this area, would just keep the issue on the agenda and would be a kind of a point of additionality in a way. And I think in terms of that issue of looking opportunistic, I recognise that is not a helpful look at all. But to the extent that more groups are going to be doing it, and I think we can say, the EM has been refreshing its strategy, and we recognise this is an area we want to do more work in, and that's why we're having this conversation. And I think, let's not be too worried about where that goes. Is there anything?
Absolutely. I think you've answered it perfectly, Caroline. Thank you very much, Paul, for your input. It's really useful to get feedback like that in order.
I'm just
We're
about
coming
to come
to you,
to you.
Stephen.
You are the very next person, and then I'm going to end up with the person at the there. So please go ahead. We're all on bated breath now, so it's got to be good.
Your breath, can you hear me all right? Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so first I'm thinking, read the environmental stuff. It really is worth, I think, an EM project or campaign in the same way that the LGBT rights, the women's issues, etc. That would help us with materials, because we always take the LGBT material to Swindon Pride. With the environment, as the lady said, our authority is with the European campaign. Although Swindon for Europe, half of Swindon for Europe has always been in XR, Swindon, and XR has always been in Swindon for Europe. That's their priority, Europe's our priority. We collaborate. Personally, I attend, or Swindon for Europe collaborate with all different campaign groups, Kill the Bill, for example, the anti-fascist groups, and I and people that come with me, I always encourage them, we always wear our blue berets and bring the EU flag, because if you look at any big successful rally or march, it's always lots of different groups who may not quite agree on everything, but they are together for that issue. And everybody else has their flag. Unite the Union, even the Hare Krishnas are identified as the Hare Krishnas, right?
Okay,
Next week, do not hide your EU flags at the Slava Ukraine march. Unfortunately, I'll be on my way back from Germany, but I would fly it.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there because there's still one last question.
Right, okay, over and out.
Thank you. I think we received you very clearly. Just to say that what Swindon EM is doing sounds like an exact perfect model of what we want to see more doing, so hooray for you. And secondly, when it comes to marches, I don't think anyone for a second or even a millisecond of a second is suggesting you don't take your hats or your flags. What we're talking about, there are different ways of having that conversation, aren't there? There's a big rally, you want to be there and visible. If you're talking to somebody in your community without there being a rally, you might not want to take your flag with you. It's up to you, but we're just suggesting that some conversations might not, might go better if you didn't. But when it comes to big events like that, then of course, not a question. Yes, last question.
Sorry, Emmanuel Macron last week at the Paris AI Summit offered France's excessive nuclear energy to OpenAI and other companies developing AI tools. There is a massive risk to sustainability. from the development of AI. I teach AI innovation and ethical development in a university. The amount of electricity and water required in data centers to power AI is a real risk to sustainability. So we need to add that to, your
Lovely.
stuff.
Thank you. Thank you.